Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome after the lunch break. Well, unusual conference online and lunch break is also unusual. Everybody is responsible for his or her own lunch, but hopefully you had one. This is the third session of our conference. And we're going to deal with nationalization of memory, and we will hear a comparative evidence from several countries. So we have, again, internationally composed panel that brings together competence from the fields of political science, sociology, history, and the law. And I am particularly glad to welcome our speakers, Dr. Manuel Becker of the University of Bonn, Dr. Pirker of the University of Innsbruck, Dr. Mateusz Tondera of the Jagiellonian Club of Kraków, Dr. Sonia Horonziak of the Polish Academy of Sciences Scientific Center in Vienna, my colleague from my Viennese office, and Professor Fryderyk Zoll, who represents the Jagiellonian University of Kraków and also University of Osnabrück. In the two sessions that we had before the break, we discussed some philosophical foundations of memory laws. Then we had a panel when we discussed international and European dimension. So now we will be focusing more on national experiences. How do we perceive politics of memories and how they are then later embodied into legislation, and whether it is a good policy or it is a bad policy from the perspective of political science, sociology, and obviously the law. And let us begin with our first speaker, Dr. Manuel Becker of the University of Bonn, who will speak on, his topic is Vergangenheitspolitik as a judicial part in modern German historical political research, wording, concepts, and controversies. Our speaker is director of the Institute for Political Science and Sociology at the University of Bonn. His interests embrace historical political research, comparative dictatorship and extremism research, ideology, party systems, and higher education policies. He has published widely on this field, and we are curious to see his take and his experiences, mostly from the German angle. Dr. Becker, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much for the kind introduction. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers of this very interesting conference for having me here and to give me the opportunity to share my view of the field of politics of memory from the perspective of a political scientist who I am. I am very much interested to come into discussions on the same topic with a more legal or historical point of view. But let's come to the topic to waste not too much time and to stay within the 15 minutes that I have. In these 15 minutes, I would like to make 2 points, basically. First, I would like to place the part of Vergangenheitspolitik in the broader field of Geschichtspolitik, to give you an overview on the general field that I deal with in my research. Second, I will assess the concrete meaning of Vergangenheitspolitik in the German-speaking context and give you a brief overview concerning concepts and controversies. Please do allow me one initial short remark. In the following, I will use the 3 German terms Geschichtspolitik, Vergangenheitspolitik, and Erinnerungspolitik. I was not really able to translate these 3 terms properly into English, as they refer in connotation and contents to a specific context. Every translation would imply a slightly or different meaning, and maybe we can figure out in discussion which translation may be the best. So let me come to the first part. Geschichtspolitik should be used as a generic term, as an overarching category for all references to the historical in politics. Identifying a subordinate category inevitably raises the question of their precise internal differentiation. However, I have found it useful to separate 2 levels of political actions regarding history. On the first level, history as an element of political action is approached instrumentally. That's level 1, while the second level approaches history materially. That's level 2. The relatively clearly defined field of history as an argument can be assigned to the level of the instrumental approach to history. This field exclusively addresses the perspective on public debates in which history appears as an argument in politics. This topic of history as an argument describes the oldest strand of attempts to conceptualize the use of history in a political context, and it is clearly underrepresented in modern research. At the level of the material approach to history are the two fields of Vergangenheitspolitik, field 2, and Erinnerungspolitik, field 3. Their commonality is a shared focus on the concrete implementation of practical political measures that relate to the past. History is always the object of political actions and designs. In terms of content and time frames, the two fields must be distinguished from one another, however. Especially in a highly emotional and highly contentious field, such as Geschichtspolitik, the factor of time plays a seminal role. The more time has passed between the subject in question and the political attempts at an historical interpretation, the bigger the changes in the general environment, along with the manner in which the matter is addressed. Much is to be said, therefore, of a systematic distinction between Vergangenheitspolitik and Erinnerungspolitik. The field Vergangenheitspolitik, field 2, encompasses actions related to the immediate termination of a former regime within the context of transformation process. In line with the preferred application to the term in the relevant literature, political measures such as restitution, criminal prosecution, amnesty, and the replacement of political elites are part of this field. In principle, both the transition from a dictatorship to a democracy and the opposite path from a democracy to a dictatorship are conceivable. The execution of former democratic leaders by a newly installed dictator would be a typical instrument of Vergangenheitspolitik employed in autocratic regime, as it intends to signal the most brutal break with the previous ancient regime possible. Specific examples of a democratic Vergangenheitspolitik include the formation of truth commissions, granting amnesty to the elites of former regimes, and compensating expropriated persons. The field of the politics of remembrance, so the field that I call Erinnerungspolitik, field 3, is broader. From a long-term perspective, it includes all political decisions related to the remembrance and memory within a given community. Dictatorships engage in this practice just as democracies do. Making the dictator's birthday an official holiday or denigrating the former political riots in the officially sanctioned reading of history are concrete examples of dictatorial politics of remembrance. Traditional democratic politics of remembrance initiatives are, for example, commemorations and ceremonies in parliament, the allocation of funds for certain museum or exhibition projects, as well as the establishment of a commission of historians to research on a particular subject. Having accessed the overall field of Geschichtspolitik, let us now have a more closer view on the role of Vergangenheitspolitik, which I consider, in accordance with the state-of-the-art in German research, as the judicial field, so to call it, of Geschichtspolitik. The term Vergangenheitspolitik was first used in 1994 by the German political scientist Klaus Offe in a publication on questions related to researching the transformation in Eastern European countries. He identified different ways how dictatorial legacies can be addressed through civil and criminal legal responses that were taken and developed by further researchers such as Konstantin Goschler, Ludolf Herbst, Petra Bock, just to mention just a few. More so than Klaus Offe, it was Norbert Frey who bears responsibility for establishing the term Vergangenheitspolitik in contemporary historical research in Germany. Having since become a seminal work on this field, Frey defined the term in his study on the interrelations within Vergangenheitspolitik between 1950 and 1955 in the Federal Republic of Germany. This definition differs considerably from Office. Frey reduces it solely to refer to the manner in which the nascent Federal Republic of Germany handled its Nazi legacy during the first half of the 1950s. So we can see, both in terms of substance as well as in application, Offe and Frey use the term in completely different ways. Offe strives for a neutral, abstractable operationalization of the term for social studies. Frey, on the other hand, narrows the scope of Vergangenheitspolitik to the concrete historical environment in the years of 1950 to 1955 in Germany. Frey uses a normatively charged, negatively connoted, and highly critical term to characterize the failure of coming to terms with the recent past during the period in question. When used as a concept in political science, it is more advisable, at least in my view, to use Vergangenheitspolitik, however, as a functional and abstract category. This entails using the term both independent of time and context, while also employing it in the most neutral manner possible. Let's come to the specific role in the research on transformative processes, my second point. As Klaus Offe's terminological work has illustrated, in the field of political science, Vergangenheitspolitik plays a central role in the research on transformative processes. The term has been incorporated through the lens of a systematic orientation. Regional research is focused primarily on Latin and South America, as well as of the former Soviet states. In light of the political science relevance of this research, the most important conceptualizations in this area should be very briefly outlined. Research on transformation and transition conceives of Vergangenheitspolitik as one of numerous components in the transition process to a democratic environment. Accordingly, a narrower definition is usually applied here. It defines Vergangenheitspolitik as the state's reprisal of human rights violations and violations perpetrated in the context of dictatorship and civil wars, thereby confining it to the level of political systems. At the center always stands the question of how to deal with people that are, as commanders of the old regime, served as decision makers and as officials and followers ensured its operation. Assembled by the United States Institute for Peace, their compilation of 21 international case studies from 1995 is now today seen as groundbreaking. Coming to terms and dealing with human rights violation is frequently cited as one of the central problems in any transition from a dictatorship to a democracy. There is a certain inherent tension between advancing, on the one hand, a morally necessary confrontation with the past, while at the same time ensuring that the always fragile consolidation of a fledgling democracy is not impaired. For victims of a brutal regime such as the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, for example, it is of vital importance to see their tormentors face earthly justice if the newly built democracy is to stand a chance of survival. At the same time, the questions of how to deal with the former elites in a young democracy can never be escaped. In his seminal study on democratization, The Third Wave from 1991, Samuel Huntington, many of you will know this, elaborated on the so-called torturer problem, how to handle former authoritarian elites that extensively engaged in human rights violations. Two solutions of this so-called torture problems present themselves whenever democratic structures are established. Prosecute and punish, or forgive and forget. This is the two nice alliterations that were coined by Huntington. Both options have their advantages and disadvantages that are extensively assessed by Huntington. Having developed 4 recommendations for actors advancing democracy, he comes to a final conclusion. It is necessary to recognize the problems present in both prosecute and punish, as well as in the forgive and forget alternatives. Sometimes the best compromise may be not to persecute, not punish, not forget, and most importantly, says Huntington, not forget. As is rather obvious, the guidelines have been conceived in such a way that Vergangenheitspolitik is always shaped by the balance of power between the former regime elites and the new leadership. Formulating general advice with regards to dealing with the past in any process of democratization is obviously very challenging. Consider the central instrument of amnesty. The trick is to organize a manner of forgiving without forgetting. Or, to use Gary Smith's catchy formula, this phrase, amnesty may not turn into amnesia. I could present to you a lot of further concepts coming from researchers and scholars such as Bloomfield et al., Geico Fahrenholz, Wolfgang Merkel or Veit Strassner, and so on. But as time is short in this conference speech, I will detail this out in my contribution for the book that is planned to be published from this conference. For now, I will come to a brief conclusion. 2 points seem important to me. First, it is obvious that the term Vergangenheitspolitik plays an important role in the context of transformation research. The relevance of Vergangenheitspolitik in the field of political science needs little explanation. Instead, it seems self-evident. Analyzing concrete, operational, practical, executive, legislative, and judicial decision-making processes is one of the central tasks of every political scientist. Second, any examination of the discourses and practices related to Geschichtspolitik offers insightful perspective about the self-image of a given state and society. And if my assumption is correct that both state and society are confronted with what is perceived as an increasingly uncertain future in the 21st century, it is to be expected that both the relevance of social affirmations rooted in history and therefore the importance of politics of memory, of Geschichtspolitik, will increase in lockstep. For this reason, political science would in the future be very, very well advised to place a bigger emphasis than before on the role of history as an element of political action. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope I was in the 15 minutes.
Thank you so much, Dr. Becker, for your insightful presentation and also for your time discipline. I think it helps us a lot with mapping the problems because my impression is that we are still struggling with properly defining concepts. So your talk that is right in the middle of our conference actually helps us to structure the problems that are relevant for all the 5 panels that we have today. The discussion round will be after we hear all the presentations. So please let me now move forward and invite now Dr. Peter Pirker of the University of Innsbruck, whose topic is First Sacrificers, Then Victims, Austrian Post-Nazi Memory Regimes in European Comparison. Dr. Pirker is a historian at the Department of Contemporary History at the University of Innsbruck. He has published extensively in the field. But one thing I would like to emphasize and bring to everyone's attention, he is the man behind the project that you can find on the website porem.wien, the way you write Vienna in German, which is a fascinating website. Porem stands for Politics of Remembrance, which is an interactive map of places and spaces in Vienna that are devoted to remembering the past between 1945 and 2018. So I congratulate you to this impressive project. And having said this, I would like to invite you now to take the floor. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for this very kind introduction, and of course for the invitation to this very interesting conference. As you are probably aware, no other concept has shaped the discussion on Austria's politics of history as much as the theory of the victim myth. In a nutshell, it states that Austrian politics of history until the late 1980s was characterized by the portrayal of Austria and the Austrians as pure victims of National Socialism, and that this strategy of victimization was successful in shifting any responsibility for the crimes of National Socialism onto the Germans. Moreover, the theory claims that victimization was the central feature of Austrian nation building. This theory about the nature of Austrian politics of history emerged in the late 1980s and became the central paradigm of historiography on post-war Austria. I would like to cast doubt on this paradigm of the victim myth and put forward the argument that Austria's national formation through the politics of history should be understood as a process in which the recognition of sacrifice was the crucial issue, while the turn toward a victimological memory occurred not before the late 1990s. I would like to start with a view on the before mentioned project I did with colleagues in Vienna on the culture of remembrance related to fascism and National Socialism in Vienna. In this research project called Politics of Remembrance, we examined more than 1,800 memorials on fascism and National Socialism that had been erected in Vienna since 1945. Assuming the theory of the victim myth, a surprising result was that in the first post-war decades, you can see it here, only very few monuments were erected which remembered Austrians as victims. Most of them praised the sacrifice of the resistance. It was not until the 1990s that monuments to victims of persecution were increasingly erected. From the analysis of the monuments, it became clear that we have to consider two different meanings of the German notion Opfer, which have not been taken into account enough in the analysis and conceptualization of Austrian politics of history up to now. In the literature on the victim myth, the different meanings of victim and sacrifice are very often blurred. Of course, in English, this difference is more obvious, but of course, it exists in German too. The distinction between a sacrifice that someone makes and a victim that someone becomes is very important for the analysis of who is worthy of public remembrance and of public welfare. In her history of victimology, historian Svenja Goltermann showed that victim as an attractive subject position emerged only in the last third of the 20th century, mainly as a result of anti-discrimination struggles of social movements in the United States and Europe in the 1960s and 1970s, as well as the emergence of the Holocaust remembrance in the same period. Accordingly, there was a social hierarchy between the attributions of having sacrificed oneself and having become a victim. This hierarchy can be seen everywhere in Europe after the defeat of Nazi Germany, albeit with varying degrees of intensity. Everywhere, early attempts to document the mass murder of the Jews ceased. Everywhere, the martyrs of national resistance came to the fore. As scholars of nationalism have shown, collective identities throughout much of the 20th century were formed through the construction of collective sacrificial efforts, but hardly through collective victimization. Even where victimization is an important topos, it is related to an overcoming of victimhood, a kind of national resurrection through resistance, struggle, etc., as in Poland, France, the Netherlands, Norway, and Italy. Why should Austria in particular be an exception? And if Austria is a special case, what does it consist of? As early as 1988, the British historian Robert Knight made an important distinction that has received far too little attention in research since then. He distinguished between the tactical function of the victim theory to carry out the separation from Germany and the legitimizing function for the construction of a state mythology, in other words, for nation building. The tactical function clearly worked out, But whether the victim theory had the power to provide a shared sense of identity, Knight doubted very much, especially in view of Kurt Waldheim's electoral success in 1986. After all, Waldheim had not staged himself as a victim of National Socialism, but as a decent veteran of the Wehrmacht who had done his duty properly and now was under unjustified attack. I think the popular argument that Waldheim won the election because he represented the victimhood misses completely the point. I think Waldheim won the election because he said exactly what had become a major pillar of the national memory regime in Austria since the mid-1950s, honoring Wehrmacht soldiers as sacrifices for the fatherland, and this was clearly at odds with the victim theory. However, the victim theory was at odds with the experiences and sentiments of around 1 million Wehrmacht veterans and hundreds of thousands former members of the Nazi Party. The political power of this milieu was the main reason why Austrian governments revised many foundations of the victim theory by way of laws, memorials, and state rituals. In this table, the legal foundations of the victim theory are listed on the left-hand side, and some key revisions are listed on the right-hand side. I cannot go into detail about all these declarations and laws. Their main purpose in 1945 was the separation of Austria from Germany and to provide a path for Austrian nation building. This was to be based on the narrative that Austria had become a victim of Nazi Germany's aggression. The state and the population had been exploited. The man had been forced into the war, but had ultimately contributed to liberation through desertion from the Wehrmacht and resistance. Responsibility was given merely to a small circle of National Socialists who were excluded from the nation and then tried as traitors and collaborators. The content of this narrative does not differ significantly from that in other occupied countries in Europe, but there are two major differences regarding the social dimension. First, nowhere did the narrative diverge so much from the historical experience of the population as in Austria. And secondly, this narrative did not give rise to a myth in Austria that was suitable for nation building, simply because major parts of the populace didn't share the narrative. A first decisive break was the 1951 permission for veterans of the Wehrmacht to organize. You see it on the left-hand side below. Very quickly, they fought the historical interpretation of victimization, which was defended by the resistance associations. The veterans rejected the role of victims assigned to them. They demanded recognition of their sacrifice. What we can observe for Austria in the 1940s and 1950s are multiple crossed lines of conflict over the question of who had made the true sacrifice. Until 1955, there was no national answer to this question from the government coalition of conservatives and social democrats. Why? Because they were itself divided on this issue. Meanwhile, the Wehrmacht Veterans Association developed into the largest civil society organization in Austria and radically changed the balance of power in politics of history. Compared to post-German states, this was a unique development in a post-Nazi society. The second decisive institutional change was the founding of the Austrian armed forces in 1955. The third, setting the course, was the integration of high-rank Nazi Wehrmacht generals into the army and the establishment of close institutional links between the army and the Veterans Association. The close cooperation between army and veterans became visible at the official reopening of the Heroes Memorial Ehrenplatz in November 1955. The mission of the assessment of the soldier service in the Wehrmacht was made by the defender Ferdinand Graf himself. He declared the Wehrmacht soldiers had fought and given their life for Austria. He praised the frontline soldiers' performance of duty, and he claimed that it was time for a new commemoration of heroes. The official recognition by the government led to the erection of countless heroic monuments to Wehrmacht soldiers all over Austria. In 1957, the Veterans Association had already 250,000 members. In 1960, veterans of the Wehrmacht were legally permitted to show their Wehrmacht orders of merit. Thus, this revisionist politics of history by the government led to a polarization, even violent riots between veterans of the Wehrmacht and their neo-Nazi supporters on the one side, and veterans of resistance and their supporters on the other side. Very soon, the governing coalition was faced with the challenge of overcoming this conflict in society. The memorial year of 1965, celebrating 20 years of Second Republic, 10 years of full sovereignty, set the scene for promoting a new national narrative. The political speech for this was delivered on the first national holiday, October 26, 1965, by the president of the National Council, Alfred Maleta. He resolutely demanded that not only the sacrifices of the patriots in the concentration camps be recognized, but also the sacrifices of the soldiers and former National Socialists. His argument was that it was not decisive what the sacrifice was made for, but that it was made. In this way, Maleta promoted a depoliticized national community of sacrifices. Victims of persecution, by the way, do not appear in this concept. The central state memorial representing the sacrificial memory regime was the Heroes Monument at the Heroes Square in the center of Vienna. The reshaping of the Austrian Heroes Monument exemplifies the new order of memory very well. In addition to the official commemoration for fallen Wehrmacht soldiers in the crypt on the right wing, the left wing was transformed into a memorial room for the resistance. Henceforth, official state rituals took place in both pillars of the Heroes Monument. In addition, both pillars of memory were subsidized by the government. In return for recognition, all mutual contestation was to cease. To sum up, the pillarized memory regime placed both visions of sacrifice of the resistance and the soldiers at the center of World War II commemoration and subordinated or neglected victims of anti-Semitic, racist, and social persecution. There was no legal framework fostering the sacrificial memory regime. Rather, it can be conceptualized as an informal set of political behavior and mutual understanding, as a hegemonic process whereby the state promotes a narrative to frame memories articulated from below in forms which serve the alleged interest of the nation. This brings me to the last point. What are the particularities of Austrian politics of history up to the late 1980s? First, a myth of national rebirth based on a narrative of occupation, oppression, and resistance failed in Austria, unlike in most countries occupied by Nazi Germany. Second, in Austria, a national sacrificial memory regime did not emerge until the mid-1960s, at the time when sacrificial memory regimes in Western and Northern Europe were already eroding. Collaboration was being addressed, and the persecution of the Jews was becoming an issue. Third, Austria was the only country in Europe where the state officially recognized and honored the sacrifice of former Wehrmacht soldiers and also of former National Socialists. Another peculiarity is therefore that in Austria, unlike countries with strong collaboration and unlike the two German successor states of the Third Reich, a central association of veterans of the Wehrmacht was massively supported by the state and could become a pillar of the national memory regime. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pirker, for your presentation. I think it will steer discussion, but for this we need to wait until the end. We are moving to our next speaker, who is Dr. Mateusz Tondera, who is affiliated with the Jagiellonian Club in Poland, Kraków. This is a conservative, influential think tank. Dr. Tondera is also attorney at law. He combines competence in law and philosophy, where his main research interests are located. And he will, in his talk, he will present the memory clashes that we identify and the victimhood rivalry, specifically between Poland and Israel. What are the two models of remembering the past and protecting collective memories? Dr. Tondera, please have the floor.
Thank you very much, Professor. First of all, I wanted to thank you for the invitation, and it's a great honor to be amongst such awesome academics, and I feel really appreciated to be here. To start briefly because of the time frames, I will focus mostly on this first part of the title, memory clashes and victimhood rivalry, because of the time frames. And yes, the main inspiration for this presentation and the article that I'm working on for the publication is the conflict, diplomatic conflict that started 2 years ago, when Polish government decided, let's put it very briefly because I don't want to focus on details here, to ban opinions that Polish nation was somehow responsible for Holocaust. This was a decision which started a domino of discussions and diplomatic problems with Israel, with Israeli governments, with the global public opinion about the history of Second World War and about Holocaust. And I want to say a few things from the point of view of someone who wants to analyze the real issue in this discussion, because there was post-discussion about this crisis almost always focused on the fact that it was a misunderstanding, that this was a diplomatic problem, and so on and so on. Of course, politics and diplomats speak in this way about situations like this because that's their role. But we as academics want to see a real issue that was behind all this discussion and behind this regulation. Where is the main idea that stands behind this conflict and this crisis? And first of all, the most important thing to say is that Poland and Israel have almost the same opinion about the idea of how to regulate historical memory by law. So it wasn't a conflict between free speech mode and let's make some regulations mode. It wasn't that kind of conflict. It wasn't the conflict that in the first panel was so thoroughly discussed. It was a different conflict. It was a conflict of two perspectives on the Holocaust, where both were agreed to the fact that the law and also criminal law must be included in the building and preserving of the memory. So the conflict was on in the different place, in the different point. And when we look closer about all these discussions that arose later, and it was very confusing conflict because it was like all these sorts of discussions, mutual. In the same time, it was in media, it was in universities, it was among the politicians. So it was a huge buzz of information on the different levels of activity and of thoughtfulness. So it was hard to sometimes catch where's the main issue or main issues that fuel this conflict and fuel this discussion, because everyone was surprised that the discussion was such huge, and that the problem, diplomatic problem, and his historical problem was so big. And I think the main focus of this conflict, and the main point where we should look for decoding that, is not a question of victimhood, but the question of perpetration, authorship, and responsibility for Holocaust. And we have two, I will use the word narration, but it's very complicated word. I don't mean it as a something false. I mean it more like a way to put many different moving parts to make a picture that we want other people to see. And we have two main narration about the authorship and responsibility for Holocaust. And I will present them as in their most pure forms for a purpose of making it clear. The first one is that Holocaust was invented and done by a German National Socialists, backed up to the point by a German nation and German public opinion. And it was the pure product of the National Socialism ideology. And then it was put to action by a man in Nazi party in Third Reich leadership. And that's the main focus we need to, that's the main point we need to see. And the collaborators in other nations and so on and so on, that's something additional. That's the additional problem. They are not responsible for Holocaust. They were somehow sometimes collaborating, sometimes they were taking part of it, but the root of the Holocaust isn't there. So this is the one narration about this. And the second one is, to be honest, completely different. And it's that the Holocaust is a rotten fruit of centuries of European culture. And seeing as that, it's like the Professor Dr. Lichtenstein said before, shared European guilt. So in that point of view, German National Socialism was only the main and the biggest fruit of this whole culture that produced Holocaust. And before it produced anti-Semitism in its modern form in early 20th century. And these two narrations, which are, it's hard to claim anyone being true or false, but they are very, very difficult to reconcile together because the accents on which we decide to put are completely different. And from one point of view, we see Holocaust as an historical event with authors, with decisions, with some kind of state apparat that stood behind it. And from the other point of view, we see Holocaust as a myth, but I don't mean myth in any synonym of something false. I mean myth like something that explains the root of of most modern problems we have. So these two narrations are really, really hard to reconcile, and it's really hard to take them both and treat as equals. So the problem between Poland and Israel in this conflict situation, from my perspective, was the fact that for the first time from a very long time, these two narrations actually met each other in the public discussion. Because before that point, these two narrations were being told separately, and they don't contradict any facts about Holocaust. None of this interpretation is negationist. none of these interpretations wants to fight with any established facts about the Holocaust and its aims, and the fact that it was one of the greatest and most terrible events in history. So both of this narration are, along with the mainstream discourse about what Holocaust is and how important is it in history. But then, when we try to focus on this narration part, these two visions have completely different functions for the memory of the nations that use them. And here I want to go to the next point. So why these two narrations are used by nations? I don't mean probably not only Polish public opinion was used to this narration about the German National Socialists as perpetrators of the Holocaust, but from Polish point of view, it was very, very important that we see other movements of early 20th century, as long with some nationalist or fascist movements, as something evil and bad, yet not the same. So this narration says, yes, we had great problems with how we treated Jewish populations, yet we would never invent something like Holocaust. It wasn't our idea, and it wasn't even in the roots of this evil or not, but problematic movements and organizations. And the second narration tells, no. That's the point. Everything was building towards the Holocaust. It happened in Germany and by a German Nazi regime, but it could have happened in a different European country, probably, because it was the rotten fruit in the culture which was growing since probably medieval Europe or even earlier. And this narration are very, very hard to put alongside without any quarrels, because if Holocaust is a fruit of whole European culture, then of course Polish culture is also infected with that problem and was infected with that problem. And many Polish scholars or normal Polish people would say, yes, we had problems with anti-Semitism, but it's not the same. It wouldn't lead to Holocaust because there is a substantial difference in the German National Socialism with its systemic racism and so on and so on. We can, of course, the next panel will be probably more about this, so I don't want to focus on that thing. But these two narrations, each very important, are narrations used in Israel for Jewish people and in Poland for Polish people. And for the first time in a long time, they met in international discussion, international area, and we all had a chance to see how different these narrations are, even if both of them aren't revisionist negotiations and so on. So I don't want to conclude in any conclusion like this narration is better, this is worse. No, I just want to show how important it is to see how complex based on the needs of social psychology of society are these narrations, and how closely and carefully we need to discuss those things. And first step is to imagine that other nations have their own needs with those narrations. They use it for something, but it's not a cynical way of using it. I don't mean the politicians use it to some evil tools. I mean nations use it to feel and think in some way about themselves. And when we see that narration of one nation clashes with the narration of another, we need to treat it like a bomb. We need to carefully disarm, not something to win or lose, because none of this narration is something we need to fight. It's not like David Irving's writings or some neo-Nazi theories about Holocaust and Second World War. It's something that goes perfectly alongside with the facts about the history, and yet something that gives us completely different impression of the meaning of history, the sense, the lesson we need to learn from the fact. And the lesson we need to learn from the Polish narration about Holocaust is a different lesson that the Jewish narration about Holocaust wants us to teach. And we can learn from those two lessons, yes, but we need to first see that this is a different way of seeing things without any purely historical debate or quarrel. That's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tondera, for this presentation, familiarizing us with the Polish and Israeli perspectives. And this conflict has been sometimes described as conflict between the brothers, because you started your presentation from acknowledging that there is a certain similarity between Poland and Israel when it comes to the very attitude whether or not to address those phenomena by legal tools. And this is not a big controversy in Israel, neither it is in Poland. We both have memory laws. It was not about having or not having them. It was about those two coming to clashes. And this brings us to the next talk by Dr. Sonia Horonziak of Polish Academy of Science Scientific Center in Vienna, who will speak about the recent and short-lived attempt in Poland not just to criminalize denialism, but to make a step forward and to attempt to criminalize defamation, which is somehow also seen as a redistribution of guilt. So the focus will be more on the political science perspective and the reception, because Dr. Horonziak is not a lawyer. She's a political scientist working on the anthropology of politics. She works for the Academy of Science in Vienna, as I told you, and all the speakers know her because she was the driving force behind this conference. And now the time has come for you, Sonia, to present your talk. So the floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Professor Radwan. And of course, it is my pleasure to be here among such an excellent researchers. Let me just see if my presentation will be on the screen or not. Okay, I don't see, but nevertheless, I have a topic prepared, so don't worry about it. So actually, I would like to tell today about, as Professor Radwan said, one of the most controversial attempts of introducing a criminalization of revisionistic defamation in Poland. And as you probably know, in 2018, Poland introduced a new amendment to the Act of the Institute of National Remembrance, Instytut Pamięci Narodowej, which quickly became known as Polish Holocaust law. And I would just like to briefly explain before, because I will be mainly focusing about the reactions, internal Polish reactions and international reactions to this new amendment. But at the beginning, I would like to briefly tell you about what this law was actually about. So there were a couple main articles added to the Act on the Institute of National Remembrance. And for example, there were added Article 55A that said that whoever claims publicly and contrary to the facts that the Polish nation or the Republic of Poland is responsible or co-responsible for Nazi crimes committed by the Third Reich, or whoever, for example, grossly diminishes the responsibility of true perpetrators, shall be liable to a fine or imprisonment. And this is not only about Nazi crimes committed during the Second World War, but also about the crimes in general against peace, crimes against humanity, or any war crimes. So there's this very broad aspect. Oh, and I see my presentation came back, so I can show you the articles. And this is the first thing that striked a lot of controversies. But there was also article, for example, 55b, which said that irrespective of the regulations in force at the location of committing the criminal act, this act, so this article, for example, 55a, shall apply to Polish and foreign citizens. That means that even if someone was in another country where no such law applied, and of course it's hard to imagine that such a law would, regarding the defamation of the Polish nation would apply in any other country than Poland. So even if that happens, the person who commit a crime according to this act will still be a subject of the prosecution. And the title of my presentation is actually "The Road to Hell is Paved with Good Intentions." And before I will tell you a little bit more why I would use the word hell as the paraphrasation of those international reactions that this amendment sparked, I would like to focus on these good intentions, because indeed the official justification of this amendment focused on something good, on something positive. Therefore, we can read in the official justification that the Polish nation is striving to protect its good name before using such a hurtful and, of course, misinterpretive statements and lies as Polish death camps or Polish concentration camps. And in the justification, we can read that because of an increasing usage of these terms and ineffective diplomatic interventions, because of course these statements were mostly used abroad, the Polish nation is somehow forced to fight for its good name and must start pursuing a real historical policy. And actually, as we probably can already see, even if I just briefly introduced only 2 articles of this new amendment, this amendment covers an area much larger and with much details than the one named in the justification. So it was not only about the statements of Polish death camps or Polish concentration camps. It was about actually every claim or public defamation of the Polish nation in case of historical event of the Second World War, but also any other events. And of course, we have this Article 55b, which brought attention not only to the Poles that might commit this crime, but also to the foreigners that live and commit this crime in the country where such a law do not exist. And maybe firstly, I would like to tell you a little bit more about Polish reactions, because I would like to contrast those with the international reactions that you probably in some part of 2018 heard of. So first of all, the main focus when it comes to the international Polish reactions was who actually and in what circumstances can be prosecuted and for what. And at the beginning, it was interpreted that on the basis of the regulation, the Polish state would prosecute scientists who provide testimonies against, for example, Poles doing certain actions during the Second World War. But it was quickly pointed out that in Article 55a, we can clearly read that no offense is committed if the criminal act is committed in the course of one artistic or academic activity. However, of course, it immediately raises the question of other types of activities. Okay, so artists and university, for example, professors can even commit the crime according to this act and not be prosecuted. But what about, for example, educational activity? So to speak, teachers, and what about the journalists? And these concerns were repeated, for example, in an open letter from nearly 100 outstanding Polish women and men with the questions, why actually, where would we set boundaries between this tolerated science and art and punishable journalism, punishable education, and who actually will establish facts that must be opposed? Because as we all know, there are some points in, I believe, history of every country, but of course, especially in Polish history, that are not until this time yet fully examined and are still sparks controversy. What about those events? What will happen when, for example, an educator, a teacher would like to address those during a lesson in school? And actually, there was an official response from the government to those issues. And there was, in this response, we could read that there should be no exception for teachers or journalists. And the government stays behind what was in this Article 55A, that is only artistic and academic activity is excluded. And of course, this is just one point of view, the Polish point of view, but then we have international reactions. Then we have this actual diplomatic conflict, political conflict that was sparked because of this amendment. And of course, we can say that the Polish reactions, it's not that they were totally different from the international ones, but they covered, because of course they covered a similar area, but the main point was put on something else. Because one can immediately see that in foreign reactions, the main focus lied on the victim perspective and how this law affects actual victims of the Holocaust, they who survived and they who do not survive, and for example, their families are fighting for their good names. And of course, the main voices in this conflict were heard, for example, from the USA and Israel. It is pretty obvious, and but actually we could hear the reactions from the entire world, and I will tell about it a little bit later. But at the beginning, I would like to say a bit about the USA reactions, governmental reactions, and public reactions, and then the ones from Israel. So the first big and kind of disturbing reaction that we received from the United States came from the United States Department spokeswoman, Heather Nauert, who said that USA are concerned about the effects that this law might have not only about the victims of the Holocaust, but on the strategic interest of Poland and its relations with the USA and Israel. So basically, the USA encouraged Poland to reanalyze this law because it might threaten the Poland's strategic interest, as it was said, with the relations with the US and Israel. This is something pretty uncommon to hear, such a strong statement that this act may actually influence the international relation in any other matter. But let me just remind you that, for example, the person who used the notion of Polish death camps was, in fact, the former president of United States, like right now, former Barack Obama. Of course, it wasn't intentional, but still, according to this amendment, it would still be a case of possible prosecution. But what I want to visualize at this slide of the presentation are actually something that came not from the governmental point, but from the press. Because immediately after an outburst of the situation, the internet was flooded with phrases such as Polish death camps or Polish concentration camps. And of course, as Dr. Tondera said, we never, it was, of course, used in some context of this new amendment, but actually we can already say that it's not always possible to explain the contracts really throughoutly, really in details. So we may just imagine that what actually got to the public, to the international public, was just those notions of Polish death camps and concentration camps. So something that was an initial thought at the beginning was the main source of why this amendment was actually put into an action. So what Polish nation tried to protect. And immediately all the international press heard was this hurtful and not false statements. And of course, the other side is the reaction from Israel. So you might say the key player when it comes to this situation. And the governmental reaction were very harsh. Actually, the country, the Israel parliament, even proposed a bill according to which denying the complicity of Nazi collaborations or reducing their participation in the Holocaust will be a crime punishable by up to 5 years in prison. So this means that the Polish amendment to the Act of the Institute of National Remembrance could be labeled as a crime according to this bill. What's more, there were also proposals that the Israel will offer legal aid to all persons who will be accused outside of Israel. And that meant that also Poles, for example, living in Poland, could be offered with the legal aid from Israel. And of course, the most critical statement came from the Israeli official World Holocaust Remembrance Center, Yad Vashem. And because, as we all know, coming to an end to my presentation, the Polish government ultimately, after nearly 6 months, decided to amend this amendment on the Act of Institute of National Remembrance, after all of the controversies it evoked. And after this, the joint statement by Polish Prime Minister Mateusz and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was presented as kind of mean of unification of two countries in this spark of controversy. But world famous Institute Yad Vashem even then criticized this statement, saying that it contains serious errors and lies about the historical facts. And of course, we all know that the question of it's not really the case of if it's true, or if it's not true, on what part should be Poland be responsible. The case is that we will not meet those statements if we hadn't got the amendment in the first place. So in conclusion, regardless of the fact that the intentions behind this amendment were aiming to defend the truth, the historical truth, the good name of the Polish nation, what we were left ultimately was newspapers and television from all over the world repeating constantly and multiplying the statements of Polish death camps, Polish concentration camps. We could see that in Germany, for example, Die Welt, Tageszeitung, Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, in France, newspaper Le Figaro, even in Al Jazeera, those notions were repeated. So just the last sentence, that maybe that way, a criminal way to deal with the defamation of the Polish nation is not the best way to try to protect the Polish good name, and if so, maybe should it compared with some more international campaign about it, why it is so important to Poland to protect its good name, and not just by introducing the given laws. Thank you very much.
Sonia, thank you very much. Your presentation, I think, highlights that the very understanding of effectiveness is quite different for lawyers and for political science. What does it mean the law to be effective? There is a special notion in the legal theory what the effectiveness is. And this story signifies that the effectiveness in terms of what is actually attained is quite different, and that there was an intention to create a legal taboo, and what was achieved eventually was quite the opposite, and never before the notion of Polish death camps has been so widely spread as when this controversial law was enacted. So we are discussing, we started with politics through history, philosophy. Now we are touching upon regulation. We will discuss mostly criminal law, but now with our last speaker for this panel, we will look at this from the legal perspective, but from a slightly different angle. We will discuss whether civil law or civil law remedies are the available tools that can be used somehow to counteract misleading statements or statements that contradict the collective memories. And this is an example that we have in Poland, but not only in Poland, in Germany, there was at least one case based on civil law. So having said this, I would like to invite our distinguished speaker, Professor Frederick Zoll, Jagiellonian University, Kraków, and at the same time, University of Osnabrück. He is a widely acknowledged expert in private law and comparative law, very influential, not just in Poland, but in Europe. He's a member of executive board of the European Law Institute in Vienna, very active in west and east of Poland, with many projects, including schools of foreign laws at the Jagiellonian University and the legal clinic. Hardly anyone has done so much for young students as Frederick did. And Frederick, as I told you, will discuss the private law, civil law dimension of memory laws. Frederick, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much. I would like to actually my short presentation is a continuation of what has been said by Dr. Horonziak in certain sense, but of course a little bit from the perspective of the legal point of view, from the perspective of the argument whether the devices of the private law can be at all shaped in this way that we could achieve something at all, and whether such kind of devices where we would like to use the private law, which is basically designed in order to protect private persons, in order to protect the individual interests. And when we have the question whether this protection of individual or devices of the protection of individual interest can be used to protect some very abstract concepts, like a nation, for example, and it is something which has happened actually to Poland. It is something which has happened in this same law, but this law has not been such discussed as this criminal part of the law. Why it is so? We can see Dr. Horonziak said about the criminal law protection of this interest. It has been declared non-constitutional. It has been dismissed. We do not have this criminal law protection in our law anymore. But what we have here, this is the private law, which has remained. And these provisions of the private law are actually much more dangerous than these criminal law provisions. Why? Because the criminal law provisions, they have all this religiousness, all the strictness of the criminal law, all these rules on protection of the criminal law infrastructure, which with all this presumption of innocence and so on, with the procedural guarantees. In all this discussion about the Polish law in the Institute of National Remembrance, somebody has forgot the matter of the matter of private law, which has been, everybody was thinking private law is not so far-reaching. The private law is not so intrusive in the, so we don't need to care about it. The truth is different. If we are looking into this provision in my poor translation, we can see that we have, and Dr. Horonziak was already talking a little bit about it. That I'm sorry, I have because my dog is belling for some reason. I have to stop it immediately. Just a moment.
Yeah, this is something that we would never have at a traditional conference. So this is something very, very specific.
I had to stop because of my dog, which was attacking somebody at this moment, so it was quite dangerous. So this is the cost of being at home. And we are talking about this provision, about this particular Article 53, and we are looking into the criteria which has been put here. And here we have the protection of the good name of the Republic of Poland and of the Polish nation. And somebody who is infringing it could be subjected to the provision of the to protection of the personality rights. And these are just very general provisions telling that if somebody personality rights, which is not defined, is infringed, you can ask for stopping it, you can claim stopping it, or in case, in specific case, or general case actually, you can also claim for compensation for material and immaterial losses. And this is somehow unlimited. So with immaterial losses, we do not have here any case law. So there is no clear rule how this claim for immaterial losses can be calculated, or damages, how they can be calculated, and damages to whom, and what are actually the criteria of these provisions. The entitled entities which are entitled to sue a person who has infringed the good name of the nation. This is this Institute of the National Remembrance of Memory, and all association which has in the statutory provision a right to and a duty to protect the good name of the Polish nation. And this frame of the provision makes for the private lawyer incredible difficulties, because these provisions are just drafted to protect your good name as individual person, and now we have to protect the good name of the nation as such. So what are the criteria for this liability? Now, there are actually none. So this is, what does it mean exactly, the protection of the name of the nation? And actually, what is the nation in this concept? Who is protected? For what infringement could be at all this action started? If you are looking into this provision, then we have a nation. Nation, it's not a legal person, it's not a moral person. We have here some kind of general public interest, and this general public interest should be protected by the measures or by the remedies which are designed to protect somebody in the individual dispute. This is extremely dangerous, because usually in this kind of private law struggle, you don't need all this protection which are typical to protect in the case of criminal law, where you are trying to protect much more general interest. And then, of course, you need probably more guarantee also for the person who is staying at the court. Here, something is designed for the private law disputes. We have equality of the parties in the theory. And of course, usually we have much more strict criteria for claims. Here, it is a very broad concept. This broad concept, all in the Polish private law, launches doubts about its feasibility and even constitutionality. But it is, and of course, it is used for always disputes on defaming somebody and infringing into good name of another person, and so on. And of course, at this level, it raises a lot of problems in case of the freedom of press, freedom of public discussion. But if we are trying to apply the system to such kind of concept, what is a nation, then we don't know what kind of infringement may happen. Actually, we don't know even what is the nation in the sense of this provision. What does it mean, a Polish nation? It is the nation in the sense of the constitution. So all communities or all citizens of our Polish citizens all together. So, for example, if you infringe a certain or defame a certain group or of people belonging to a certain minority in Poland, it is the infringement of the good name of the Polish nation, or not? Or you have to say no, it must be some general assessment of Polish nation as what is the kind of concept which is, of course, probably here not used in the constitutional sense, but it is somehow used in the language of ethnical concept in this law, law on a national institute. Actually, only one nation is named, are the Ukrainian Nationalists. By the way, these Ukrainian nationalists were Polish citizens generally. So there is also quite interesting problem how to apply at all this law. And probably, of course, it is not applicable. Nobody has applied it really yet. There are some threats of the lawsuits, but not really has been enforced. And probably if the court would face this problem, probably he must say, oh, this is so unprecise, so indefinite, that also it must be somehow declared non-constitutional, or I cannot really apply this provision in the given sense. But we can see here how the system has been constructed, that the lawmaker has somehow foreseen the difficulties with the criminal law and has established a second system, indeed far more reaching than the criminal law provisions, far more dangerous, because there is here no limitations of journalists. There is no limitation of no journalists, but academic. There is no other limitations, so it really can confine the freedom of academic research, and it has sometimes much more strong chilling effect than even the criminal law procedure, although there is not this link to this criminal consequences, some kind of diminishing or infringing also a certain sense the good name. In the civil law it's not happening so strongly, but financial consequences maybe much higher. The problem is, and this is something which we have in our current situation, and it cannot be somehow forgotten in this particular sense. But before I am coming to this last issue, I want also to look on this small another problem, that if we are talking about immaterial losses, there are not limits, but also the material losses. It is completely misleading concept here. What does it mean, material loss to the nation? How the nation may suffer a material loss? Even how the Republic of Poland may suffer the material loss, because it's not the treasury, it's just the public law institution. So how this infringement of the good name may cause losses in this private law sense. So this is something which, of course, has not been really conceptualized by the lawmaker, who wanted to create some kind of weapon, but of course without having any kind of preparation for handling the quite delicate private law devices and tools. And finally, we are coming to this problem. But this provision could be, in normal times, could be just ignored. It could be said, this is completely, actually crazy. It is not possible that such provision does exist in such vague and not precise setting, and completely going beyond the function of the private law and the protection beyond of the private law, and inviting to some kind of expansion of the imprecise provision, which the application is completely left to the court. So the court may say, yeah, this is the infringement of the nation and this is the loss, and this is not really criterion somehow to review this decision of the court. But of course, if you have the independent courts, the problem is not so dramatic, because then the court must come to the outcome, oh, I cannot apply this provision at all. The problem is if the courts are not independent. And what is happening now in Poland, and what is the situation of the judiciary and the threats for the independence of judiciary, the abuse of the disciplinary procedure, if the outcome are not exactly like the government is willing to have them, then such provision without definite criterion could be extremely dangerous. It could really, at this time, be used against everybody and fulfill some kind of political purposes of the government. Of course, in the future, it must be deleted immediately, but it's a threat which exists now. Thank you very much for attention.
Professor Sol, thank you very much for your presentation. We have now some approximately 20 minutes for a discussion. And this will be mostly among us. This is the downside of online conferences. And I took several notes, many notes actually, and I have a couple of questions to at least some of our speakers. My first question would be to Dr. Manuel Becker. I have heard of a study conducted not very long ago. It was actually a public opinion poll where respondents were asked in Germany if in their families or in their ancestry they have rather perpetrators or victims. And there were more respondents to point out to the victims in their families or ancestry than to perpetrators. And my question would be, would you consider this a success or a failure of the Erinnerungspolitik in Germany? So this would be my first question, and maybe you can answer it right away.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much. If I am right, I think it was this the surveillance that was made around the 8th of May by the German newspaper Die Zeit and another institute together, if I'm correct. That was the figures that you cited. I think it's difficult to set it up in the two category of success or failure. I think it's just gives us a clue what is the general problem of remembrance as such. Many people just tend to see their past brighter than it was or brighter than it is, which is some kind of maybe typical human psychological dealing with the past. Of course, it's a task for a scientific way of dealing with the past and also for politics of dealing with the past. And the figures you've quoted just underline this basic human approach that one has to history in general and to one's own history. And especially if it's about family history, people tend to have no clear scientific point of view, to mention it like this, which is in my eyes in some way understandable. But still, it stays the task for us as researchers, for teachers, for journalists, just to put things into the right context and to give a proper view of the past, having always in mind that we never can have the past as itself. Remembrance is always something different than the past as it was. We are not able to go back and see it as it was. We can just try to be the most objective we can.
So does it mean that you think it is like a natural trajectory of memory, or is it rather an outcome of conscious politics of memory? The one thing that comes up to my mind is a movie that was quite popular in Germany. In English, it is Generation War. The German original title would be Unsere Mutter, unsere Väter. It caused an outcry in Poland for the way the Polish underground home army was portrayed. And in the discussion in Germany, there was one of the reasons offered was that the generation that still remembers war is passing away, and it is like the last years of people who are still alive, and this would be an opportunity for them somehow to look back in a more nuanced or positive way. And this was like offered as one of the explanations why this movie was produced by, to remind everyone, by the public broadcaster ZDF.
Yes, I saw the movie, and I also followed the reactions that were in Poland. Just to be complete, in Germany it was also controversially debated, but not as controversial as it was in Poland. But we also had a lot of criticism in Germany about how this movie portrays certain nations and certain people, of course. Basically, yes, we have to deal now with the problem that the so-called Zeitzeugengeneration, as we say in German, so the people that lived the past, they are now dying away. And this is always linked with a transformation of memory politics. And it is a task and it is a problem, of course. But basically, I am of the opinion that the official memory politics in Germany or any other democratic state in the world, I think we as scholars, we tend to over-exaggerate their effects. I think the effect is not that big on the people that you can have with some monuments or historian commissions and whatsoever. I think it's just a special part of society that is more educated, that is more interested in the things that deal with the things. When it comes to the normal citizen, I think official politics of memories is quite limited in what it can do and what it cannot do. May I also have a question for one of the others, or what do you want to start?
Yes. Go ahead.
Because I just wanted to, I had one question to what Dr. Tondera pointed out. You very good, you pointed out those two narrations of narratives of the Holocaust, the universal understanding of Holocaust and maybe the more specific understanding of Holocaust. And I have a question concerning this. First question is, can this in some way be translated into a more, how shall I say, conservative and progressive, more national, more international, more left-wing, more right-wing understanding, or is it transcendent to these categories? And second question, maybe how is it in Poland debated, those two? Is it really that we have most people that stick to one of those two narrations? Or is it also controversial? Is it maybe also a question of age? I would be interested to hear some more of you concerning those things.
So to answer this briefly but correctly, for the first question, I think that today in the discussions as we have them, it's linked quite strictly with the worldviews of the discussants. So yes, the more historically and Holocaust as an event way of thinking about it is often associated with the conservative world view and the conservative way of looking at the history of Poland and other countries. And this more universal is often associated with the left-wing way of looking at the role of the culture and the blame that is transisted in the culture. Yet I don't think that this discussion really has to be that way. I think that on the philosophical level, We can be conservatives who see events like this in a universal way, like the idea of the original sin, for example. Yeah, we can discuss the idea of Holocaust as an fruit of the culture, more like a fruit of the fallen nature of the man, for example. So there is a take to have that point of view without being liberal, for example. And still we can have people who are more liberal or left-winged, and yet they, for their own reasons, want to discuss historical events in very concrete, factual ways. Maybe they are maybe they have kind of scientist approach to the history, which happens quite often, and they don't like to see. They hate historiography as a concept. They don't want to discuss the meaning of history because they think it's stupid, it's misleading. So they don't want to discuss the meaning of the Holocaust as a myth because they think it's a rubbish discussion. They want to condemn the crime and discuss it as a historical event. And in Poland, it's pretty much the same, maybe stronger. So yes, it's now we have all this bubbles and blocks when you have when you are sympathizing with idea A, you have to sympathize with idea B, C, D, E. Yeah, you really don't have to, but that's how the discussion works, and it's pretty strong in Poland. But I think that in the light of the worldwide discussion about Holocaust, whole discussion in Poland is kind of shifted in the side of more historical and explaining what really German National Socialism was. I think it's more toward this, and this people who see Shoah in this very universal way are less represented in the discussion statistically, because of course there are people who see Holocaust that way and want to discuss about Holocaust in that way. Can I have my question too with the system of the putting another question to someone else, because I want to ask Dr. Pirker about one thing which was very, very interesting to me, because I'm wondering about that narration about the Austrian Wehrmacht soldiers as people who made sacrifices, because I'm really keen to understand if there were in Austria the bigger narration or given a ration to what they were really sacrificing for. Was it just soldier ethos, don't talk about it anymore? Or was it kind of a bigger interconnected vision of the cause they were fighting for as something that was packed with this idea of sacrificing a Wehrmacht soldier?
Thank you for this interesting question. Yes, the portrayal of the Wehrmacht soldiers changed a lot from, let's say, 1945 till the early 1950s. What we can see is that in 1945, the Austrian government called the Austrian Wehrmacht soldiers to desert the Wehrmacht and to support the Red Army during the liberation of Austria. What we can see in the early 1950s, and this is also connected to the Cold War, of course, is that the Conservative Party in Austria and the right-wing Freedom Party, they start to portray the Wehrmacht soldiers as fighters against Bolshevism. Yeah? And this clearly connected very much to the Nazi propaganda and to something, to a specific value of Wehrmacht soldiers during their training and during their fight on the Eastern Front. Yeah? That happened in the early 1950s, and this is something we can understand as the German philosopher Theodor W. Adorno called the afterlife of Nazism in democracy. Yeah? And this was the way how Austrian political elites integrated Wehrmacht soldiers into post-war democracy. But this was a specific kind of democracy. It was a very authoritarian democracy. And what I tried to show was that this Austrian sacrificial memory regime, which was constituted in the 1960s, had a very long-term impact on society, and this could relate to the actual laws in Poland, yeah, because we have to ask what are doing these laws to the society itself, yeah. Are they some kind of narrating discussions? Are they some kind of trying to shape and to promote certain pictures society should follow? And that was something what happened in the 1950s and 60s in Austria with the transformation of the image of Wehrmacht soldiers.
Thank you very much.
If I may, I would like to follow up on that question that was asked to Dr. Pirker. Your talk was mostly this tension or transition from victimhood towards sacrifice. But we might also use, and I am referring again to Michał Łuczewski, to another triada this time around of heroism, victimhood, and being a perpetrator. And the last category somehow didn't come up so much in your talk. And we are right now in a time when some of the questions are being discussed, like, for instance, what to do with the birthplace of Adolf Hitler, the house, for what purpose should it be put? A discussion ongoing in Austria. Also, a discussion that attracts public attention about commemorating Gusen, also for quite some time, Hartheim. Mauthausen is, of course, more known than the other two that I just mentioned. My sense is that we have a new wave of this discussion. And if we, again, go back to this triada, the winners, the heroes, they try to to build their moral capital based on this quality. The victims, who are the losers, might be, from the moral standpoint, the one who won eventually. And this is basically the story that Israel is specifically effective at making. And Poland was actually for a long time at this camp, and this what we have this rivalry that Dr. Tondera was talking about is basically the rivalry about the victim status. Now, what Germany did, it was quite different. Their strategy towards building a moral capital was rather through portraying Germany as the ones who learned the lesson, like the converted perpetrators. They were able to build a civil society that is for many exemplary today. And my question would be the most recent development in Austria, this last threat next to the sacrifice, next to the victim.
Shall I? Yeah.
Please.
This is a very interesting topic, and if you look how Austrian political elites now use the theory of the victim myth to build the image of Austria, then you can see that they are able to talk about the victim myth, but they are still not able to talk about perpetrators. And if you look at the landscape of memorials in Vienna, you will hardly find any memorials, museums, and exhibitions which address the topic of perpetrators. You know that Vienna had one of the largest Jewish communities in Europe, and the Nazis invented the system of deportation in Vienna, the so-called Vienna system, but you don't have a permanent exhibition in Vienna till this day about this Vienna model, for example. Yeah? We have a lot of memorials for the victims, but we still don't talk much about the perpetrators, the Austrian perpetrators. There's no center of documentation similar to Munich or Berlin or Köln about National Socialism perpetration in in Vienna. Yeah, that's the state of the art we are talking about.
And if I may, we are approaching the time that we have for this discussion, but still I would like to address the topic that Professor Zoll presented. It was about the civil law dimension, and Professor Zoll focused on the statute on the Institute of National Remembrance, where in fact it also offers a civil law remedy, and this is what was discussed in the presentation. And I must say, this is true, and you rightly mentioned that there is no case law based on this provision, so probably this is maybe not as dangerous, but what we do have in Poland, we have a couple of cases, maybe not very many, but we have a couple of cases based not on these specific provisions, but based on general provisions of the civil code that provide for remedies for individuals who feel infringed upon in their personal rights. And those cases are, I think, quite different from you theoretically described the possible abuse. You pointed out to unlimited claims. You pointed out to the fact that basically any NGO established in order to pursue those claims could claim whatever damages. This is something that never materialized. But what has materialized, and not very often, but there are a couple of cases, maybe 5, are the civil law claims or litigation before civil court, where the plaintiff is either a survivor, like Karol Tondera, who was himself a prisoner of a death camp, suing German media house ZDF for using the notion of the Polish death camp. So this is the one case. The other case is based on the movie that I just mentioned before, Generation War, by a veteran of the Home Army, portrayed as anti-Semites. And there were also some cases where the claimants, the plaintiffs, were the heirs, like the children of the ones who were prisoners of the death camps. And the reason why they wanted damages, and it was not about money, it was basically about counter-statement, about conceding that it was a false statement. It was not about earning money. It was simply about correcting the false statement. And this was quite precise and quite narrow. It was usually simply and only about using a notion of the Polish death camps, that a person who himself, as a Polish citizen, was a prisoner of this. And this is obviously the question. I agree. This is from the systemic point of view. For us lawyers, it is difficult because it goes somehow across the system of civil law, because the personal rights, they require a specification. So you need, usually it's not enough to be a member of a larger group. Usually you need to be like Frederick Zoll, another Pole, or a citizen of Kraków, or whatever, or the member of the university community, or whatever. Usually this is the general rule for infringement of personal rights, that you must be either infringed in your individual capacity or in a group that is really narrow, that it comes really close to being this individual. And the nation is a much bigger group. So there is this problem of this purity of civil law. But on the other side, it might be also seen as a form of private enforcement of memory laws. And then when it comes to clashes, is you have something that is seen in a way as a public objective, and usually for this you have public law. But as we discussed also in the previous panels, criminal law is very ill-suited to defend moral values. Censorship and moral capital do not really fit together. And maybe this is the reason why civil law instruments are being used as the ones who have lesser negative connotation, because you have not a state-appointed prosecutor, but you have an individual. And if this individual is either directly a former prisoner of the death camp or children of this person, then you have quite a different setting. So I would like you to ask to please briefly comment on that.
Not tailored to answer this question. This kind of sorry. This is no. I'm
okay.
Oh, it's okay. That was okay.
I'm unmuted. The private law is not tailored to answer these questions. It is a very dangerous development in Poland. It works in very different directions. It is not used with provisions on protection of personality rights are used to, for instance, to justify the claims based on the infringement of environment, of clean environment and right to live in the clean environment. We are used to settle many of public interest issues which are not somehow settled by the administration of the state. So this is somehow the effect of the malfunctioning of a lot of functions of the state as such. But people are trying to use the instruments of the private law, which are in Poland in this situation tailored in very, very general way. But it means there is no specific rule. Everything can be specified by the court applying the law, and this is something which could be very dangerous because it could really affect the debate. It could really go very far into general freedom of speech. And despite the fact we are talking about the private person using this instrument of the private law directly in trying to protect some very general interest of the society, and the court without having criteria decide so. And of course, in the time where we have a kind of state policy and also an instrument as a disciplinary procedure, which may impact on the judge making a decision, it starts to be extremely dangerous. But what I wanted to say, of course, these are cases of somehow malfunctioning of the private law, which may also infringe the rule of law as general. But here we have even more to go into this direction. The lawmaker is somehow aware that he does not provide criteria for any kind of decision. So this is just completely a free assessment. And of course, it is not only a private law enforcement, because he is really trying to give this right to the institute, to the governmental institution, and of course to some association, but basically to governmental institution, which should sue people in case if they think, oh, this person has infringed the good name of the Polish nation. So we see not precise. So this is something which completely infringes or circumvent the principle of nullum crimen sine lege, because we have a sanction which is sometimes even more severe than the criminal law sanction, and we do not have a specification of the behavior which is forbidden. And this is a private law which is used actually with the criminal law function to circumvent all principles, which makes the criminal law so difficult. But the criminal law is so difficult because it protects the freedom in free society. And this private law, this expansion of using the concept of the protection of the moral rights, it is something, it's an instrument which apparently does not infringe with principles of the criminal law. But of course it does. And it infringes the principles of constitution actually developed for the criminal law. But of course it must be interpreted functionally. So all this guarantee of the criminal law must be taken also for such kind of provisions. We do not have cases now, but it is quite easy to have them in the future. Because it is just the political decision, could be a political decision of the Institute for National Memorization, and one of the system of enforcing on judges the decision where you can use the instruments of the disciplinary procedure, what is already happening to Poland. So this system is really a danger. And I don't think so that even in all these cases, what you are talking about, I think this is not the real way. So if the state thinks it is so dramatic, it must be protected, it must be then protected by public law means with all guarantees of the public law. It cannot be just left to the private law, which has completely different tasks in the society.
I agree fully when it comes to the systems, how the lawyers tend to think, but the perception is quite different. And Dr. Horonziak told us how the effectiveness of the law and the systemic purity comes to clashes with the actual effect. And we need to put an end to the discussion. I just want to clarify one thing. The cases that I mentioned that was brought to the civil courts, that all predate the controversial reforms of judiciary in Poland. So those should not be mixed. They were all initiated before the controversial changes. So it would be easily to be misinterpreted that it is like a political reaction, where in fact it is not. It is not.
No, this provision is a political reaction.
I'm not talking about this provision where we have no cases. I'm just talking about a couple of cases that we had based on the general provisions of the civil code
the situation
that ended
before,
up with cases.
It is quite easy to answer. The situation before, it does not change at all. But we have here incentive to circumvent it is not an accusation about our current government. It is a device which under normal situation is something which could explode in certain, it depends very much on the free assessment of the judge. It is something which we don't want to in the private law, but the judge is just, we are coming to certain opinion, bias of the judge, and this judge has no governance, no basic rule from the system to say how I should judge this case. So he is freely, and is somehow not possible to verify whether this decision is right or wrong. For this reason, such kind of general clause is a threat for the free society, and does not matter whether it is today, where today the existence of such rules is much more dangerous as it was before.
We need to stop here because of time constraints, but I take it as a promise for this discussion to be continued on other occasions, and also in writings in our publications, to which I'm very much looking forward. I would like to thank all my participants, and let's have a break that is going to be shorter than we actually wanted it to have, but since we are changing panels and the coffee breaks can be actually done anytime, let's have a 5 minutes break, and then we will proceed to the panel number 4. Thank you so much.